Thanks for coming out, everyone.
Anyone here wants to sign up on this?
Okay, so the format's a little different tonight. It's going to be an interview and then a poetry reading. We all know Lamont Steptoe here. Hopefully by the end of this, we'll get to know him a little bit more. I'm just going to read his bio, and then we'll talk. Lamont Steptoe is a poet, activist, Vietnam veteran, photographer, and founder-publisher of Whirlwind Press. Steptoe has a clear, direct, and matter-of-fact approach to a sociocultural subject matter, and his language is rich and revealing. He's the author of 14 books of poetry, has performed his work at the Library of Congress, National Library of Nicaragua, and the Geraldine R. Dodge Poetry Festival, Shakespeare & Co. in Paris, the Knitting Factory, the Schoenberg Center for Black Culture, and various colleges. So please welcome Lamont.
Thank you, Sean.
Let's try to get comfortable.
Thank everybody for coming. New faces, old faces. It's an honor to be here. The one thing that wasn't included in my bio, I guess, was that I'm a Pew Fellow. So, yeah, they gave me the Pew back in 2006. And it was 50,000 then. Now it's 75,000. It went up to 60,000 2 years after I won it, but I was just glad to be in that league.
So I'm just going to start off right at the back because I know you have a lot to say, especially with these questions. So in honor of Black History Month, we're going to be talking a lot about Black history. So the first question: you grew up poor and Black in Pittsburgh during the early civil rights era. What are some of your earliest memories of discrimination, both on a personal and then on a historical level?
Well, I didn't grow up as a Black person. I grew up as colored and Negro. I didn't become Black until the 1970s. And that was, of course, when integration was everyone was pushing for integration, you know. And of course, I was born in 1949, and the Supreme Court decision in 1954, pushed by Thurgood Marshall, that ended segregation, was something we were aware of and pleased with, but we were still colored and still Negro. And I never had any idea about a relationship with the African continent. I remember that I just came from my 50th high school reunion in October, but I remember that when we were studying history, and especially the history of the Civil War, and they talked about slavery, and I went to a very integrated school. When I mean integrated, we were, my elementary school and my high school were both 60 or 70%.
This was in the early 50s, right?
Yeah. My classmates were 60 to 70% white American. But every time anything about Africa or antebellum slavery came up, I remember all the white kids would turn around and look at us Black kids. So that was something we went through. After elementary school, when we got out of class, these were back in the days where you went home for lunch, in elementary school. You went home for lunch, and then you went back to school. And there was a group of us that would always gather and literally run and pretend we were cowboys or whatever. And one time, we ran across this lawn, and this white man came out, and he looked at us and he says, where I come from, we whip people like you. But there was no overt racism among my classmates, although I was a Cub Scout. And when I went home, I found out that the woman who was initially our scout, a den mother, the white parents had talked to her and told her that they did not want their children interacting with Black Scouts. So she flipped it to another childhood friend's mother, who was black, and then later that childhood's mother flipped it to my mother. But I had no idea until 50 years later that the reason all that happened was because they did not want their children playing or being in a scout troop with black kids.
So what about on a historical level? Like, what was the first time you ever heard of civil rights activism, maybe in the South, Freedom Riders, or?
Terrifying. You know, the first thing that I heard about was what happened to Emmett Till. My mother was born up south. Some of my uncles were born down south. I found my grandfather and great-grandfather in the June 1880 census of Spotsylvania County, Virginia. And my great-grandfather was 46 years old. He was classified as mulatto. He was illiterate, and he was a sharecropper. My grandfather was 8 years old, and he was also classified as mulatto. And so my mother used to say to me, God rest her soul, my mother used to say, your grandfather looked like an old Italian man. And that was true, you know. When I had two incredible experiences when I was 7 years old. The first was, we're walking through this middle to upper middle class community in Pittsburgh called Howland Park. And I'm 7, my younger brother's 3 or 4, and my sister was 10 years older than me, so she would have been 17. And I pointed to one of the houses, and I said, why doesn't Mama buy us a house like that? And my sister said to me, Lamont, don't you realize we're poor? And it was a bright sunny day, but it seemed like the sky got dark and it started to thunder and lightning. That was the one seminal moment. The other seminal moment at age 7 was my mother told me, she said, Lamont, you have a lot of relatives that I can't introduce you to because you're too dark and I'll hurt your feelings. So those were two of the most seminal moments in my childhood because, you know, I came from a family that was color struck. And so, and my mom always said, she said, when you lose me, you'll have lost your best friend. You'll never have another friend like me. So my response to understanding that, of being, you know, persecuted because of my complexion, was that, oh, I'll just be smarter than everybody. I'm going to read books. And I was always a bibliophile. I always had my head buried in books, and I grew up in a rooming house. The most significant 7 years of my childhood was in this rooming house that was oversaw by my Aunt Minnie. Now, Aunt Minnie, her father and my mother's father were brothers. And Aunt Minnie was like the grandmother I never had. So I watched, it was almost like a Thomas Wolfe experience. You know, he was famous because his mother ran a rooming house. So I would see all these older men, generally, and a couple women, pass through my life, you know. So that was an experience. But some of them only had third-grade educations. Some had no education at all. But the one thing they would say to me, as they saw me with my head buried in books, they'd say, "You stick with those books, boy. You stick with those books."
Right.
And I did.
Right. So and then you ended up going to Temple University in Philadelphia, and when you were a student there, one of the most remarkable stories that you've told me is about your experience when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and you were studying in the library. Can you tell us a little bit about Philadelphia's reaction to MLK's assassination, and why that event made you do what you ended up doing.
Well, I'd like to begin, first of all, before I got to Temple University. I told my mother, and I was a junior, 9th grade, and I told my mother one day, I said, Mama, I want to go to college. My mother only went to the 10th grade. My older sister only went to the 10th grade. My older brother only went to the 10th grade. So I was the first one to graduate from high school. And I told my mom, I said, Mom, I want to go to college. And my mother said to me, son, don't be no educated fool. And I said, what do you mean by that, Mom? She said, you'll find out, just don't be one. And then she told me, I don't forgot what you got to learn. So that was my impetus, you know, and I promised her that she would see me in her life graduate from college. But when King was killed, I was in Paley Library at Temple University, and I was working on a term paper, and the subject of my term paper was comparing and contrasting the life of Gandhi with King. I walk out of the library at 8:30. This man, you know him, Sean, Ted McGee, walked up to me and said, did you hear what happened? I said, no, I've been in the library all day. He said, they killed Martin Luther King. I was living off campus at Broad and Dolphin, and I went back to my apartment and stayed up all night listening to the black radio stations eulogize King. All hell was breaking loose in the streets outside in North Philly. The next day I watched white parents come in and take their kids back to the suburbs. All the black kids in the high schools walked out and marched to Independence Hall, where we heard speeches, and I joined them. The next day, I went to the Army recruiter and said, how fast can you get me out of here if I volunteer for Vietnam? He said, 3 weeks. I said, where do I sign? I just wanted to get out of America, you know, to literally get out of this place where they had killed Martin Luther King. And a lot of the students, my fellow students, tried to talk me out of it. My English professor said, Lamont, I know you're romantic, but those are very real bullets. I said, I'll be fine. Another friend that I had met over the summer at Strawbridge and Clother, where he had just gotten back from Vietnam, he was in the first battle of the Ai Drang Valley, the battle when the United States Army first met the NVA. He was in that battle. 400 men surrounded by 2,000.
That was the North Vietnamese army as opposed to the Viet Cong.
Right. So he takes off his shirt and he shows me 7 bullet holes in his back. And he said, you want this to happen to you? I said, that's not going to happen to me. He said, okay, be stupid. He said, I'll tell you one thing, Vietnam's going to make you cry for your mother. That part came true.
So you obviously witnessed horror in Vietnam. How did that have how did it ironically inspire you or have an effect on you to become a poet?
Well, I've been a poet since I was 10 years old. Since the minister of my church, Reverend Augustus C. Sumter, I was raised in a Methodist church, and there would be talk in the neighborhood about how they were going to redevelop the neighborhood and gentrify the neighborhood. So we were going to lose our church and lose the place where I grew up. And so I wrote a lament, and I read it to several groups in the church, and the word got back to Reverend Sumter, and he announced from the pulpit one day, he said, we have a poet in our midst. And when he said that, a little light went on, and suddenly I understood why I was so weird.
So, so Uncle Blue South China Sea, or Uncle's South China Sea Blue Nightmare.
Yeah.
And but that was primarily direct documents. There was the letters at the beginning of it, right, to your mother, and then poems that you wrote over there in Vietnam.
Yeah. But before Uncle South China Sea Blue Nightmare, I published Mad Minute.
Yeah.
And that was my first book about my experiences in Vietnam. And I have to say, the poet Aaron Yates Perry inspired me because when we met at Bacchanal and all of that, he was like, man, you should write about it, So Uncle South China, Mad Minute was the first collection, Dusty Road was the second collection, and Uncle South China Sea Blue Nightmare was the third collection. And the University of Massachusetts Press is coming out with a book published this month by a PhD scholar, a British subject, called A Shadow on Our Hearts, which deals with the soldier poets created by the Vietnam War. But I went to Vietnam consciously as a writer. I had read Hemingway and what he did in the Spanish Civil War. I had read Alan Seeger, I Have a Rendezvous with Death. I had read Wilfred Owen. And in my mind, I said, oh, to be a great writer, you have to put yourself in harm's way. And if you put yourself in harm's way and survive that, then you'll have this authority no one will be able to question.
Absolutely.
So off I went to Vietnam. That was part of it.
Yeah, which is also why your friend called you a romantic, but at the same time you were...
My English professor called me a romantic.
Yeah. It's ironic though, because this empire, the American government, which is oppressing black people here in America, as Muhammad Ali came up with he connected the two.
Yes.
I'm not going to go fight the white man's war against another oppressed people in Vietnam.
But see, I grew up in a family. My mother was the 10th child. My uncle, her youngest brother, my Uncle Eugene, was in World War II. He was in the invasion of Normandy. His whole unit was wiped out, except for him and a chaplain. And they survived by pulling dead bodies over on top of themselves as the Germans bayoneted the dead. My second cousin, Monty Dawson, died in the Korean War. He was wounded and taken into captivity, and we still haven't gotten his body back. And then my late older brother was a lifer in the military, 101st Airborne and a Ranger. And my mother loved military men. I was in ROTC before I left to join the Army. And my mother used to say, you can't be much of a man if Uncle Sam don't watch you.
So you were a sergeant in the Army, but before that you dropped out of ROTC and then became a sergeant.
I was a corporal in ROTC, and then I went when I joined the military, they made me an acting jack, a sergeant in basic training. And when I got to Vietnam, I earned my sergeant stripes. But I just, like I said, my mother loved military men, and she said, you can't be much of a man if Uncle Sam don't want you. And being 5'3", I had my share of being bullied all my life, and you have to remember that Hitler was short, Napoleon was short, Attila the Hun was short. So I had all this angst about proving myself as a man.
That's completely understandable. So when you came back from Vietnam, your path to becoming a great poet, it escalated at certain points throughout the 1980s, mostly. You mentioned Bacchanal earlier. That was the bar on South Street in Philadelphia.
Owned by Joe Tiberino.
Yeah, who passed away last year, and it was a meeting place. I had never been there, but people who've been in Philadelphia since then might remember that the artists and poets would meet there. And
yeah, it was a watering hole for people who were involved in all aspects of the arts. I did a number of visual, because I'm also a photographer, so I did exhibited some of my photography there. I read there, and my sister's husband, he used to say to me, he was somebody who thought that artists are a bunch of lazy people who don't want to work. And his attitude, one time I read a couple poems. When I moved to Philadelphia, I was living with them, and I read some poetry that reflected on our childhood upbringing. And my sister was very displeased with it. And I went to bed, And the next morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning, I sense somebody comes in the room. And I look, and it's my brother-in-law. And he goes into the cupboard where I keep my journals. He finds a poem that has offended my sister and rips it out. And then when I went off to war, I had left some of my journals with them. And when I came back, they had destroyed all the work that I had written between 1963 and 1967. Which, you know, I mean, Mishima, the Japanese writer Mishima, his father used to do the same thing. He would take all of his work and make him burn it in the trash can right in front of him and say, "You're not going to be a writer." You know, Yukio Mishima had to deal with that same attitude from his father. But I just persevered. I knew that this was my salvation, and I always felt that, just like I was arrogant about, I'm not going to get wounded in Vietnam. I'm not going to get killed in Vietnam. Now, what I didn't know, because I had enlisted, I had 3 years to do. So I did if I had come back to the States after my 12 months, I would have had to get up in the morning, shine boots, spit shine boots, starch fatigues, taking orders from someone who had never been in a war. So I said, well, I'll just spend the next year in Vietnam. So they told us, well, if you do another 6 months, then we'll drop the other 6 months. So I said, cool. So I came back and people said, wow, you made it. And I said, yep. And I said, but I'm going back. And they're like, are you fucking crazy? And my response was, listen, I'm making $1,000 a month. I'm smoking the best weed in the world. And I'm sleeping with Asian women. And I love the adrenaline rush. You're goddamn right I'm going back. So I went back, But I didn't realize the psychic damage that was occurring, because when I got to Vietnam, I was 20 years old. The human body develops up until 21.5 years. So in that developmental period, if you are exposed to terror and trauma, it's imprinted into your system. Like when it's dark outside, I'm on ambush. I'm hypervigilant, I've officially been diagnosed with PTSD. My daughter, God bless her soul, when she was 3 years old, she was the first person to notice something. She said to me one day, "Daddy, you have a serious problem." And it took me 10 years before I went to the VA hospital and said, "What's wrong with you?" But the younger you are, the more damaging this trauma is. And it has physical repercussions. When they do autopsies on combat veterans, they find our adrenal glands are abnormally enlarged. Our primitive brain, our medulla oblongata, gets larger. Those are the physical effects of PTSD in a combat soldier.
James Baldwin, Samuel Allen, Dennis Brutus.
And Etheridge Knight.
Etheridge Knight.
Etheridge Knight.
So of those four legendary, famous writers, can you just try to quickly maybe impart like one piece of advice or piece of wisdom that they gave to you when you knew them?
Well, I was reading James Baldwin as a teenager. I read James Baldwin all through high school. It took me 19 years to actually meet him. But he helped me deal with the inferiority complex that I was carrying, because being told that I was too dark all my life. He helped me deal with that. But I was one of those kids that always liked to sit up under the old people. I like to hear stories. I wasn't so much interested in playing with my own age group. I wanted to hear the stories told by the old folks, and so that's what that's where that pattern started. And I always realized that older people were to be respected. I was raised in an environment where you always spoke to an older person, Mr. or Mrs. you did not want to be embarrassed in front of your parent by, you know, saying something that was out of, you know, children were...
That I have written down. So since we're talking about Gwendolyn Brooks already, she's one of my favorite poets of the 20th century, of all time. She's one of my favorite poets. Probably one of the most skillful poets of the 20th century, you know, let alone Black history.
Before the MFA program.
Yes, before the MFA program. And she was the first Black person to win a Pulitzer, right?
That's right. And when she won that prize, and Gwendolyn told me this herself, the poet Wallace Stevens, who wouldn't win it until 1955, said, "Who let the coon in?"
I never liked Wallace Stevens' poetry anyway. It's way too dense. So, is it, all right, I'm skipping ahead to this question. Gwendolyn Brooks, I think she's one of the most skillful poets of the 20th century. Any, like, writing advice she ever gave to you? Like, anything that you can remember about writing poetry, or anything that she just...
I'm going to write something about this, because one day I went to one of Gwendolyn's workshops here in Philadelphia at the Sheraton Hotel, and I presented her with a poem that I had written that had to do with roaches. And she wrote a number of things about how to improve the poem. And then somehow Sonia Sanchez asked me for this. So I let her take the original poem with Gwendolyn's corrections on it. And I still haven't gotten that back.
Oh man!
I need to do that.
Hopefully Sonia still has that poem.
Or hopefully she hasn't given it to some institution.
Yeah.
You know. But the other thing, every time I would see Gwendolyn, and Gwendolyn was a seer, S-E-E-R. Gwendolyn was a seer. And she appeared at Kutztown University one time, and I traveled up there, and Etheridge Knight had just died, and I showed her the article about Etheridge's death, and she said, "I can't believe because Gwendolyn was the one who discovered Etheridge in prison." And she said, "I can't believe I'm reading this." And then she looks at me, and she said, "Lamont," and just, in essence, what she was saying, this was before I was diagnosed with PTSD. And remember, Etheridge Knight was a Korean War vet. And she looks at the obituary, and then she looks at me. And I said, "Oh, Gwendolyn, I'm fine. And she just looks at me. And then I have like at least 14, 15 books autographed by her. Every time she would autograph it, and then she would write, "Hold on!" exclamation point. Hold on. And this was before I realized that what Vietnam had done to me. And the other thing she told me, just like Margaret Walker Alexander told me, she said, "Boy, you better stay off those planes." She said, "There's too much happening up there." Gwendolyn died in December 2000. Philadelphia Inquirer contacted me, and this was before I had a cell phone. I just had a beeper, and I see the number of the Philadelphia Inquirer on my beeper. I'm like, "Oh, they're calling me. Someone must have died." And they told me Gwendolyn had passed, and would I write an appreciation piece, which I did. But I have followed her advice. I do not fly anywhere in North America on a plane. I go everywhere by train. Now, I have to fly overseas, readings in Paris, readings in Lithuania, places like that. But I'm a nervous wreck, I'm a nervous wreck while I'm 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, especially 100%,
Right.
PTSD. So hold on, don't fly in an airplane.
Right. Well, Margaret Walker said the same thing. She said, "Boy, you better stay off those planes." If Margaret Walker couldn't get there by land, her son would drive her. If she couldn't get there by car, she wasn't coming, because she did not believe in airplanes either.
So, James Baldwin, one piece of advice, one piece of wisdom that he imparted to you, real quick.
Well, the first time I met Jimmy, and he had to give me permission to call him Jimmy. The first time I met him was a friend of mine. A friend and I had gone to the Afro-American Museum. This friend we didn't know each other yet. And I was working at the Painted Bride, and I'd never met Baldwin, although he had greatly influenced me. And I said, I left work and went to the museum at 5:30. This thing started at 8. I went and took all these books and sat in the front row. I had never seen Baldwin in person. Someone had called in a death threat. So he came with 4 bodyguards, 2 huge black men in back, 2 huge black men in front, and he was in the middle. And this was when he had just published The Price of the Ticket, his collected essays. So now if you're in the front row, by the time it comes to sign books upstairs, you're going to be, when you get upstairs, there are going to be 30 people back. So I go upstairs, and I have all these books, and a trustee of the university of the museum said, he's not signing all those books. Jimmy would have sat there and signed everybody's book, just like Gwendolyn did. And my face fell. One of the bodyguards saw the look on my face, pointed to me, parted the crowd, and then in less than a minute, I was in front of James Baldwin. And my first words to him were, Mr. Baldwin, I have waited all of my life for this moment. And that photograph that appears on Whirlwind magazine is my photograph that I took seconds before I said to Jimmy, I've waited all my life. I took the photograph and said that to him. He put down his pen and shook my hand. That was the beginning of our journey. And then, like he said on one of my books, he came here to Philadelphia to hear Aaron Perry and myself and Sean Henderson read at Bacchanal. And he met us at the Clothespin. He had 2 young people with him. And we went up to the top of Center Square and ran up a $100 liquor bill.
Scotch, right?
So then,
Scotch.
For him, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we get in a taxi and go to Bacchanal. We walk in, there's 80 people there. And people are like, oh my God, that's James Baldwin. So I say to Jimmy, I said, you want to say something to these people? He gets up and he says, it's nice to see all of you, but I'm here to hear them. And he sat back down. And that was the first time I broke bread with him afterwards.
Wow. Yeah, so his humility, even though he was a giant, somebody who, took court, he gave advice to, JFK, RFK, he was sitting in the same room
he cussed out Robert Kennedy.
Well, he cussed out, gave advice, cussed out RFK. Don't blame him.
But see, Jimmy, he told me before he died, he said, Lamont, I'll be more famous dead than alive. And we know how famous he was alive.
And he's coming back to us right now again.
But he was right about that. I mean, his fame has just increased and increased and increased. He was a prophet. Jimmy Baldwin was an honest to God prophet. For real, for real. And what he wrote about me while we were sitting up there in the top of Center Square, Jimmy had he could look right through you. He was like my mother. My mother had a mole right here on her third eye. You could not fool my mother. My mother could read you in 30 seconds. Jimmy Baldwin could read you like that. And I gave him, there was an Esquire issue published, and it was the 50th anniversary or something of Esquire, and they had republished an essay by Baldwin about Harlem. And I took that to him and asked him to autograph it. And he looks at me, and then looks down and writes what he writes. And what he wrote was, Lamont Steptoe, a most valuable brother witness. And I use it on my books. And that's the thing we have to remember about Baldwin. He was a witness. He was a 14-year-old preacher. And then when he left the church, he always emphasized being a witness. Be a witness to your time,
So yeah, that is it. That bearing witness, which you and I co-founded Whirlwind Magazine
right.
4 years ago. and that was the tagline, is bearing witness,
That's right.
all inspired by James Baldwin.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
so real quickly, before we move on to the last question, Dennis Brutus, South African political activist, poet. You put him up, you published his book, you went broke publishing his book, you couldn't pay the electric bill because you published his book. There were times where the government, this was the Reagan administration at the time, was spying on him and you, giving phone calls and payphone booths. So there's so much you could talk about, and we have so little time. But for Dennis Brutus, just can you quickly sum up what kind of wisdom he imparted onto you?
Well, Dennis taught me writing is a long distance run and requires stamina and endurance. I first saw Dennis Brutus on television in a story when the Reagan administration was trying to deport him back to South Africa, and which would have meant certain death for him. He was teaching at Swarthmore as a visiting professor, and it was his last day there because he left Swarthmore because they would not divest. They would not divest in South Africa. So I called him up on the last day and asked him if he would do a residency at the Painter Bride, and I would write an NEA grant for it. And that's what happened. And we just met for 5 minutes, and we were instant friends. Dennis was a fire sign. He was Sagittarius. Baldwin was a fire sign. He was Leo. And my other mentor, the poet Sam Allen, he was also a Sagittarius. So we clicked, we clicked. And one of the reasons I didn't have a phone for 20 years was because while I was dealing with Dennis, I knew about these other forces, and I said, well, I'll just make all my contacts through work, They're going to have to work hard to follow this, But Dennis was my mentor for 22 years. Sam Allen, who died 2 years ago at the age of 97, he was my mentor for 30 years. And Sam and I actually went to Dennis had told me, Lamont, you have to go to Nicaragua during the Sandinista revolution, when the Iran-Contra thing was going down. Dennis said, Lamont, you got to go to Nicaragua. So I was like, sure. I love adrenaline rushes, sure. And my daughter, who was 2, said, Dad, you're going to get shot.
Yeah.
She said, Daddy, you're going to get shot. I was like, no, I'm not. She said, yes, you are. You're going to get shot. But I went with Sonia Sanchez in '87, and then I later went back in '88 with Sam Allen. A lot of Vietnam veterans went to Nicaragua because we wanted to be on the side of the Sandinistas. There were many Sandinista poets that had died in the war, and they revere the poet in Nicaragua. All you have to do is say, "Yo está poeta," And I had never, Sonia and I read in a stadium with 500 people just to hear poetry. It was an incredible experience.
So, the last question is a combination of 2 questions. Your journey in life, it's an incredible journey, and you fought many battles. Recognizing, there's 2 things, recognizing, yourself ethnically and racially, even like as a dark-skinned black person as opposed to light-skinned, which your family members or where some of them are light-skinned. And then there is another facet to your life is recognizing your sexuality and how that is different than a lot of even growing up in the 50s America is different than the mainstream and then the last part of it is mental health. Your PTSD. This question is just what are some words of encouragement that you can give to people who are, whatever their battle is, whatever they're fighting, if they're oppressed somehow internally, externally, but is there a mantra, is there some kind of encouragement that you've just followed by just to get through the day?
Well, being a grandfather has helped. I'm a cancer survivor. I've had 3 operations for cancer, and my cancer is a result of Agent Orange in Vietnam. And having a daughter who loves me, and her mother is a medical doctor. She went to medical school at age 40. My daughter's a licensed practical nurse, and having the two of them on my side, and their medical knowledge and alternative medicine. I was just talking to Larry about how my daughter has gotten really deeply into essential oils. And there's some things that have occurred. Last year, 50 homeopathic and naturopathic doctors were murdered in the United States under mysterious circumstances. So Big Pharma is doing its thing, and they don't want to see this kind of information, you know, get to the grassroots people. My last cancer doctor at Fox Chase, they started to talk to me about, well, you know, we might want to do chemo, we might want to irradiate you. I looked my doctor straight in the eye. I said, I will never do that. You will never do that to me. Never. I said, I take cannabis oil. And he just looks at me, you know. And I still take cannabis oil. In fact, I have it right here. And they take it, you can get it at Penn Herb. You can get it at Penn Herb. This size costs $42. And you just put 2 drops under your tongue every day. And it's been found to be very effective for a lot of people. So I'm a Reiki practitioner also. I've been studying Reiki and been a Reiki master dealing with this energy since 1999. And that combination of things, plus the fact that I want to see my grandchildren turn 21, that is what keeps me here. You know, that is what keeps me here.
So family, love. You went through 2 cancer surgeries? 3. So just love, right?
Yeah, and belief in yourself. I mean, a lot of times when they diagnose you, you have cancer. Trust me. When they told me at the VA hospital I had cancer, it put me on the shoulder. Some people just give up. You have to be strong-willed. You know, I said to my cancer, you're not taking me out. You know, I'm not done my work. You're not taking me out. I rebuke you. I rebuke you. You know, and you have to have that kind of attitude of fighting. You know.
Right. I mean, but also when it's your time, your time. I mean, some people, they fight it and they still. You don't lose. It's just it's too much. Cancer is too strong. But like with you, you have a mission, right? You have
a mission. Yes.
Yeah. You want to be here, and you've got to write. You've got to publish. You've got things you got to do.
That's right. And I'll tell you about a mystical experience I had. I have this dream, and I'm standing in this room that's totally black, and I'm standing in a pool of light, and a voice comes out of the darkness and says, how old do you want to live to be? And I said, 80? And then I woke up, and I asked my spiritual teacher, I said, what was that all about? She said, oh, they just wanted to know how long you needed to finish your work. I said, shit, I should have said 100. You know, if I make it to 88, you know, that's the mark. I'll be done by then.
Okay, so let's hear some of your work then, right? Before we hear Lamont's poetry, I just want to take a quick side note and let you know that in 2 days it is Lamont's 69th birthday, and he has some books for sale, some new broadsides. So as your gift to him, you should buy some of his work, and it's also a gift to yourself, right?
That's right. As soon as I sign it, it's worth at least $100.
There you go, on Amazon, right? All right, so he's gonna read some of his poetry and then go mob him and buy his work from him. All right? Thank you, Lamont.
I need something else. This poem I wrote for my nephew for his first time. The first time they call you nigger. For Montez Edwin Trapp III, my nephew. The first time they call you nigger, your head will erupt like Vesuvius, drowning your age of innocence like the village of Pompeii. Hot, molten lava will rush through your veins at the speed of light, searing your heart with third-degree burns. Your vision will blur, refocus, then blur again, while small Central American wars break out in the catacombs of your mind. Hound dogs will pursue you down the corridors of confusion as you escape through southern swamps looking for the North Star. The first time they call you nigger, you'll be one with the cremated Japanese at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who left only their shadows behind. You'll be one with South African miners forced to vomit daily as they emerge from the ground that no longer belongs to them in search of stolen diamonds. You'll be one with old black women in white folks' kitchens humming spirituals in godless temples of alabaster. You'll be one with stolen kings and queens scattered like gems across midnight floors of oblivion. The first time they call you nigger, you will suddenly know all about your mama, your daddy, grandma and granddaddy, and great-grandma and great-granddaddy, and great-great-grandma and great-great-granddaddy. Suddenly, you will see like you've never seen before as the cataracts of youth fall away. Not until you meet God Almighty Himself will vision be so intensely vision again. Now, I never heard of Langston Hughes all through high school. I didn't even hear of Langston Hughes in college. The only black poet I knew about was James Weldon Johnson and his poem Creation, which was in my English high school English book. And so since Langston and I both are Aquarians, his birthday was February 1st, and all my mentors, Sam Allen knew Langston, Sonia Sanchez knew Langston, Amiri Baraka knew Langston. I was 1 degree away. I graduated June of '67. Langston died in May of '67. So once I did my homework on him, I so much wanted to meet him that this occurred. The poem is called The Big C for Langston Hughes. The Big C was his second autobiographical book about his life. The Big C for Langston Hughes. We met in that place where time doesn't matter, on a hillside, dappled in sunlight and shadow. At our feet, the anaconda of a river, a pure blue, imitating sky. He wore his youth like a necklace of ivory teeth. His words were water and wind. His eyes changed like the moon. He told me things only the dead know, and marveled that I could move in his world and yet return to my own. He gifted me with 1,000 diamonds of light to carry to the end of my journey, bound up my wounds with history, mojoed me back to morning before disappearing into the big sea. He's I met Langston Hughes' literary executive, the late George Houston Bass, who taught at Brown University. And I talked to him about, we met at a party, and he was the publisher of the Langston Hughes Literary Review. So one of the first questions I asked Professor Bass was, what's this about Langston being gay? His response was, I lived with him for 5 years. I washed his laundry. I typed his poems. And never once did he bring home a lover. And I said to myself, well, maybe that's because one was already living there. But the Langston Hughes folks, there's a film called Looking for Langston. And when this came out, it alludes to Langston's gayness. And when this came out, the Langston Hughes estate had an injunction placed against that film, and every place where it was shown on U.S. territory, any reference to him being gay had to be deleted. But I did all my homework on Langston, you know. What We Is. Now, all the time I was growing up, you know, I used to be crucified by fellow classmates that would say, well, black people anyway, black fellow classmates, they would say, you talk like you're white. My daughter went through the same thing. They said, you talk like you're white. So, I mean, I can speak the King's English, but I also recognize the value of Ebonics, of black language, the way black people talk to each other. And this poem is sort of deals with that. What we is. We's a hollering and screaming people. We holler and scream when we born. Our parents holler and scream at us as kids. Grow up and holler and scream in church. Holler and scream in bars. Holler and scream at women from speeding cars. Holler and scream at demonstrations. Holler and scream making love. Holler and scream when our numbers hit. Holler and scream when the law goes upside our head. Holler and scream at funerals for the dead. Holler and scream when our lovers walk out. Holler and scream at landlords. Holler and scream over basketball and football. Holler and scream over bodies on Saturday night streets. Holler and scream on the dance floor when somebody steps on our feet. We some hollering and screaming people. This whole opioid thing affecting everyone across the country, no one really paid attention to this until it made its way into the suburbs. I wrote this poem in 1996. America don't give us happiness. We gotta buy it in a bag or a bottle or go to church on Sundays. Our days be horror movies with hound dogs, flaming torches, and mobs on our ass. And that's more pronounced now than because of who's in the White House. I'm just hoping, my wish is that all those slave spirits that built the White House and built the Capitol, that they do their work.
Amen.
And that Abraham Lincoln do his work, because Abraham Lincoln does haunt the White House. Kennywood. There was a film, a documentary made about this. It's about an amusement park outside of Pittsburgh where we were all taken as children. And every year in high school, this is where we'd have our picnic. Kennywood. Kennywood and Westview Parks were Pittsburgh's Disneyland. Mama filled many a shoebox with sandwiches for a day's outing. Getting there was as much fun as being there. The streetcar rocked and rolled like an amusement ride high above the river. Wide-eyed and chattering, us black kids were jazzed with joy. Our minds filled with popcorn, cotton candy, hot dogs, and ice cream. Oh, Mama, it was the best time of our lives. The ozone smell of the bumper cars and roller coasters were the odors of heaven. Howdy Doody was everywhere. What did it matter? They didn't want niggas in the pool. Looking. You know, I'm blessed because being a bisexual man, I mean, I was in love with my fellow classmates when we were in first grade. I was falling in love with them, you know. And before my mother died, I just said to her one day, I said, Mom, you know, my mother never talked to me about sex, never. Except one time I was in, we used to go to the boys club, and something happened, and I told this older kid working there, he was like maybe 17, 18, and he did something, and I said, you cocksucker! And he looks at me and he said, you're a nasty little boy. And I didn't even know what the word meant, so I go home and ask my mother, what does cocksucker mean? But you know, I think the healthiest approach to gendered people are the way Native Americans looked at it, which was, you're two-spirited. Looking. I looked for you up the street, around the corner, down the block, and over the way. I looked for you in every airport, every train station, every bus station, every sidewalk cafe. I looked for you at carnivals, picnics, flea markets, politically correct demonstrations. I looked for you in art museums, at national monuments. I looked for you in the zoo. I even looked for you walking all alone like me. I look for you at flower shows, open air markets, all night diners. I look for you in all the places people like me look for you, looking for me. In terms of Vietnam, this book, by the way, the artist who did this, his name is Noel Miles. His birthday is also February 1st, and we used to work together at ABC News, and he's a direct descendant of Frederick Douglass. And speaking of Frederick Douglass, they're celebrating the 200th anniversary on February 18th at his house in Anacostia, and I plan to be there. This poem's called Dap. In Vietnam, all the black soldiers, you know, you didn't walk past a black person without giving up the dap, you know. You just did not acknowledge another black face in Vietnam. I mean, it was a whole ritual. So I wrote this poem called the Dap. Dap in Vietnamese means beautiful or beauty. A ritualistic handshake among blacks in Vietnam as a sign of unity and brotherhood. It was the handshake of brothers, the handshake of black men in a war zone, fists striking fists, black hand side to black hand side, fists striking fists, up, down, over, around, a rhythm of righteousness in an unrighteous war. It was the handshake of difference, the handshake of resistance and struggle, a secret code that carried the weight of ancestors. It was a handshake of renewal, faith in a black world and African history. It was a handshake of drums and forests, of words unsaid but heard. It was the understanding that your life was always on red alert, that home was as dangerous as Vietnam. It was the knowledge that your duty was survival. It was the beauty of the blueprint of your being. A few more, because I know we have no reading coming up. I saw something on the internet the other day, and it was like, now back in the day, there was no such thing as child abuse, okay? So they had this litany of black women telling their children certain things, right? Like people would say to you, I'll smack you into the middle of next week. So I amplified that. I'll smack you so hard, I'll smack you into the future. Let's see, I'll smack you into the future. I'll smack you so hard, you'll be missing for millennia. I'll smack you so hard, it will take light years to find your ass. But like I said, boy, my mother told me when I was 16 years old, she said, you'll never be too big for me to knock you down. And I'm 5'3", and she was 5'2". So, you know, but now, when I was raising my daughter, she said, go ahead, hit me. I'll just dial 911 and have you locked up. Why can't snowflakes be dollar bills? Why can't hailstones be nuggets of gold? Ouch! Okay, this is some, I write in these journals, these moleskins, and there's a tradition. Hemingway wrote in them. A number of other people wrote in these moleskins. They were originally published in Paris, but now they're published out of Italy or something. But if you can get your hands on a moleskin, it's a wonderful thing. Another person that was significant was meeting Allen Ginsberg. You know, I had Allen read for me at the Walt Whitman Center when I worked there, and I had him read for me at the Painter Broward Art Center. And when Allen first met me, he looked at me and he says, how did you get such a sweet spirit? I said, my mother? You know, I only met my father once for 5 minutes when I was 4 years old. And I'll say this poem. This poem was published in the Patterson Literary Review. Mama and me ran across my daddy in 1953. He said, what's he like? She said, just like you, stubborn. We walked away that day. I said, who was that? She said, that was your father. 3 years later, in 1956, I asked Mama what I was supposed to write on the forms at school in the space for father. She said, write deceased. And I did, from 1956 to the present. At some point, Daddy really did die, which I never knew for sure. Till late one night in a spiritualist church in the 1970s in Philadelphia, a medium uttered, your father's here and would like you to forgive him for not being a father to you in life. I forgave him intellectually, but my belly and heart still remain in turmoil about black daddies that disappear on black mothers and don't ever send no check, no letters, not even a teardrop. Daughter is 16, a moody season of storms and rainbows, a beginning remembered, a blood ritual of screams. Daughter is 16, between childhood and grown, a landscape of dreams and prophecies. Ancestors are drumming history, cakewalking liberation in diamond shoes, and the scarlet skirts of sunrise. Daughter is 16. I'm glad I could survive her 16.
But